But what's going on right now is that we're starting to revisit and redefine what wealth means as a collective, taking into consideration the technological advancements and societal shifts, which are inviting us to revisit what we value. And I truly believe that when we revisit value, we inherently revisit wealth because we're wealthy when we have an abundance of what we value.
Welcome to Wealth Coherence. I'm your host, Emily Bouchard, a social worker specializing in human development and fascinated by human potential. For over 20 years, I've been a coach to families with successful businesses and leaders with successful careers. And you may be surprised to learn that true wealth is about coherence. When our inner state of being aligns with how we live, give, lead, and love. In this series, we will explore an integrated model to flourish coherently, because wealth isn't what we have, it's who we are when we are fully aligned. Welcome to this episode of Wealth Coherence. So thrilled to have you here and to have an amazing guest that the moment I envisioned doing this podcast, I thought, I really want to have Jennifer Wines on the show. She's a kindred spirit and she has so much to offer and share. She's an attorney. She has worked in the financial industry for years. And most recently, she left to write a really inspired book called Invisible Wealth that we're going to be talking about and how that dovetails with this idea of wealth coherence. So what I love to do is invite Jennifer to welcome and share just a little bit about your journey and how it brought you to writing Invisible Wealth. And then we'll get into what you have to say there. So.
Perfect. Emily, thank you so much for having me. It's such a delight. I'm absolutely honored. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, when we first connected, I think we exchanged notes via LinkedIn, and then we had a chat, and it was just like the most glorious chat I can remember distinctly. I was in Miami and the sun was shining in and we were talking, and I'm walking around the apartment, and it was just like a beautiful, beautiful conversation. So I'm so fortunate and grateful that we've been able to continue to develop that. And thank you for having me on. And you're exactly right. By way of brief background, let's see, how far do we want to rewind the tape? I'm originally born in Mexico, formative years in Canada, and moved 10 times by the age of 20 within Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And then ultimately found myself in Boston, which is where I went to undergrad and law school. And I took the bar in Massachusetts. I sat, and while I was waiting for my bar results, I decided to apply to legal jobs and non-legal jobs because the market was atrocious. It was 2010. And during that time, I got the opportunity to join Goldman Sachs in our private wealth management group. And I joined Goldman my first week I was there, I got my bar results that I passed. But at that point in time, I was like, this seems great. I really want to start my career here. And that's what set me on the trajectory of all things wealth, particularly all things wealth management. And so started at Goldman, was at JP Morgan Private Bank for a bit thereafter, followed by Fidelity Private Wealth Management, based in New York. So I've learned all things wealth management at some really reputable, wonderful entities, and I'm forever grateful for that. It's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then I'll say this, through thousands of client conversations, right, in the advisor seat, thousands of client conversations, I started to notice that there was a shift going on, right? There was a shift in how people were thinking about wealth, right? They were thinking about wealth in a more holistic way, in a more multidimensional way. Couple that with the fact that they were also starting to think about the great wealth transfer. Not in those specific terms, of course. They didn't come to me and say, hey, I'm thinking about the great wealth transfer. But the point is that they were thinking about, how do I transfer wealth from one generation to the next? And what do those conversations sound like? And so for me, this is going back 3 years now, April 22, I decided to leave the wealth management advisor seat because I saw that these seismic changes were going on within the industry. And I really wanted to take a different perspective or a different look at what wealth is, with consideration for these changes that are underway, right? Both technological advancements and societal shifts. And as a consequence of these observations and the research and such, I ended up writing Invisible Wealth in 9 weeks, and it came out 9 months after. And that was May 2030. So it's been a little bit of an adventure ever since. And I'll just leave it at that for now. But that's broad stroke my background. So law, private banking, and private wealth management, followed by this inspired, intuitive inclination to leave the advisor seat and write Invisible Wealth.
Oh, so glad you did. And it's really furthered this conversation in a way that's been needed for quite a while. And it's like you had your finger on the pulse of what was happening in the wealth management space in a way that most managers did not, or weren't seeing it in the same way. And I think that's one of the reasons why the invisible part of invisible wealth makes so much sense. I'd love for you to offer your definition of what wealth is, because it's a great place to start. And we're talking about wealth coherence. So when you think about it and the people you've talked to and what you've determined, what do you see as the definition of wealth?
Oof. I love this question. It's also the question that inspired me, in effect, to step away from the advisor seat, because I started to think like, wow, I've been in this thing called wealth management for like a lot of years. And I talk about this every single day, but what does wealth actually mean, right? And again, because people were wanting to revisit and redefine wealth by virtue of the conversations we were having, these themes, these patterns were becoming more and more obvious to me. And so I left the advisor seat and I started to research, right, the axioms of wealth through a future forward lens. I'm like, what are the fundamentals of wealth? Where did it come from? What's the genesis? What's the origin? What is the essence of what wealth is? And with that, I decided to take a look back before taking a look forward, right? Because I want to understand where something came from in order to understand where it's going. That's often a productive place to start. So when I did some research, I saw, and this is kind of my legal brain, I fell in love with the written word during law school, right? So I have this affinity to look at words in this like really obscure way. But I was like, okay, so where did the word wealth come from? And it turns out the word wealth came into our lexicon in the mid 13th century from England, from the root well or wheel, depending on the source, but in effect, meaning well being and health. So wealth really found its definitional roots in health and well-being and embodied this essence of like happiness, right? But here's the thing, like over time, wealth became synonymous with an abundance of money and material possession. And there are many evolutionary reasons for this, which I detail in the book, but largely a byproduct of the increased sophistication of money and the increased sophistication of economies over time, right? So as money got more sophisticated, economies got more sophisticated, our concept and definition of wealth ended up changing. And it ended up to start to mean or be synonymous rather with money, right? So you think wealth, you think money. They kind of were one and the same. But what's going on right now is that we're starting to revisit and redefine what wealth means as a collective, taking into consideration the technological advancements and societal shifts, which are inviting us to revisit what we value. And I truly believe that when we revisit value, we inherently revisit wealth because we're wealthy when we have an abundance of what we value. Right. And so that's the ethos and the genesis, or I guess the invitation rather, that
Mm-hmm.
invisible wealth puts forth is that we're wealthy when we have an abundance of what we value. That's the bottom line. So the book for me was a way to think about wealth in a more holistic, multidimensional way. Although when we think about wealth and you ask me, well, what do you think wealth is? And I say to you, well, you're wealthy when you have an abundance of what you value. Then like we're kind of suspended in this abstraction, like, well, okay, what does that even mean? And and that's exactly why I developed like the five principles of invisible wealth, right? So these five principles are intended to help to bring this abstraction into action. They're intended to bring like a framework to this big concept, right? That just is unapproachable the way that we've been talking about it so far. And so with that, and this gets to your comment about invisibility, which I can expand on a little bit, but with that, I'll just take the opportunity to briefly share the five principles, and then I would love your reaction. So the first principle, as you might imagine, is money and investment. Right? The second is health and quality of life. The third is knowledge, status, influence. The fourth is time, energy, and experiences. And the fifth, last but not least, is relationship with self and others, right? And so when we look at these five principles, we'll see that these five principles, right, these five groups of assets are all inherently valuable to the human experience, right, to human flourishing, because everyone values these assets. And all of these assets are increasingly or inherently intangible, hence the whole title, Invisible Wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I love that. I will often say that, if I see somebody homeless, and encounter them, and my mind goes to trying to understand their reality, my first thought isn't what happened to their financial wealth, but what happened to their relational wealth. So it's like such a foundational piece. Like you can lose everything you have financially, but if you have all of those other aspects of what you shared, you can still be quite wealthy and thrive. But if you
Hmm.
don't have those relationships and a clear sense of who you are and your identity, and you're not in your values play, and you could have all the money in the world as well, and you could be quite bereft. And that also made me think when you were talking about the values piece, because when I think about wealth coherence, the main part for me is that coherence from the inside that then gets expressed externally. And I was in Palm Beach recently at a family office conference and was staying on the intercoastal waterway, and it was during the big yacht show. And uh, got to watch these beautiful, enormous yachts go by. And it would be like, there'd be one that was just stunning. And then another one would come that was even bigger. And then another one would come that was even bigger. And I kept imagining what it was like for the people that were on and owning these beautiful yachts when a larger one went by, and if they're externally focused on what they value, right? Because yeah, we need to kind of clarify this thing about what we value. Because if you're
Hmm.
valuing the status and identity externally and what you have, there's always going to be something bigger. There's going to be something that's going to eclipse what you have in some way. And then how does that impact you and how you look at and feel about what you bought that you were so happy with, that you thought was going to bring you what you wanted? So I would love to dive into what you talk about in terms of tapping into what you really value, because that's such an invisible, intangible thing. But I think that people get confused and think it's the external. And if I just had this thing out here, then I'd have that happiness. Oh, if I just, they talk about keeping up with the Joneses, but it's so ingrained in our culture in terms of the comparison and how comparison robs us of, and such an enemy of that
Hmm.
sense of well-being that you were pointing to. So I'd love to hear you express how you approach the whole idea of how to touch into what you really value.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's also, and by the way, I love that, visual that you just presented in terms of the different boats coming by and, what people are thinking and are they satisfied with their current, situation or reality, and, or are they looking to or longing for something different, right? Or something better or bigger, whatever the case may be. And I think, it's interesting because there's an element of that which I think is a part of the human condition in the sense that we're always trying to optimize for things in some shape or form, and then it's needing to put that on a leash and figure out, are we optimizing for the right things and why. And again, that's why I think these five principles are kind of a handy just way to think about where we're pointing our attention and why, right? Like perhaps it's the relationships, as you mentioned before, that would really help to build richness and provide value to someone's life, right? So like which assets are we focusing on and why? Is it the boat or is it relationships, right? Like which is more important at the end of the day? And it's for you to decide and optimize what you think is most important and why. Now, so you asked the question about, what do we value and why? And ultimately, I think there are keys to unlocking the answer to this question. And the keys to unlocking the answer to this question is that your values determine what you value, right? So if your values determine what you value, then a great understanding of your values is going to inherently inform what you're valuing and why, right? They provide the why behind what you're valuing. So I think the wealth conversation actually is a values conversation first and foremost. Because if you know what your values are, then you're going to understand what you value. And if you're wealthy, when you have an abundance of what you value, well, then you can kind of like back into the values. And it's, this interesting little relationship here between values, value, and wealth. Wealth, value, values. So I think it's an invitation for us. The wealth conversation is an invitation for us to think about what our values are and start there. And that's going to inform what we value and why.
Yeah, and we could spend a lot of time on that, because the clarification of our values is so important. And I often will recommend when I'm working with people on that very thing is to really uh, think about how you're spending your time, you're spending your dollars. Like if you really aren't, if you think, oh, well, these are my values, and you just check them off a list, that's one thing. But it's another to say, where are you investing yourself? We often talk about money, but our time, and I love that experiences are such a part of what you're talking about too. Uh, how we spend our time is way more precious than how we spend our money, because that's a commodity we don't get back, right? Every minute that we spend, that's how it's spent and how are we
Mhm.
investing that. And so I often will ask people to look at their calendar over the last 3 months and really assess where they've spent the majority of their time and how that reflects certain values that they have and how they would articulate that. So kind of
Mhm.
going from your actions to the thinking behind them to the values that are motivating them can be really helpful for people. And oftentimes people will find themselves caught up in what you and I might call a pendulum of reality that takes you and just swings you in a certain way. And you're like, oh my God, I spent so much time on social media, or I spent so much time,
Mhm.
gaming, or I spent so much time partying, whatever it might be. Like there's no judgment, but it's more like, wow, I'm investing a lot of time there that's not necessarily expressing what I value. And that's
Mhm.
like something that's taken us in a certain direction. So I think that that's an important part too, to remind people that they have say about how they not only express who they are in the world, but like having that intentional volition in terms of, oh, what is my value that's behind this and motivating this, and then choosing to be more self-expressed there. So I'd
Mhm.
love for you to
Mhm.
share a little bit about the experiences part of the invisible wealth, because I think that that really speaks to that, like that choice to
Mhm.
explore that.
For sure. Well, it's fascinating because much of my book looks through the lens of like the next generation. And I mean that in the sense that I'm looking through the lens of like specific years. So seeing what trends are happening through a certain years rather. And so what we'll see is that people are spending more on experiences than they are on things. And this has been a trend for a few decades now. And particularly the 1%, right? So the 1% spends more so on education and health than they do on material things, generally speaking. And so that's fascinating because there's this collective movement towards spending money on experiences rather than things. And this conversation comes up a lot with families and such. It's like gone are the days, again, generally speaking, where people are thinking about like, what can I buy for my son or for my wife or whatever the case is. It's like, no, we're going to go on a family vacation and we're going to go help people elsewhere, and you need a frame of reference. You know what I mean? So it's these experiences that actually people are recognizing and embracing are really so valuable, because not only are they valuable for you, and in the book I talk about experiences both in terms of ordinary experiences and extraordinary experiences, right? But if we think about extraordinary experiences, those are the experiences that are going to stretch the essence of our being, right? That are going to expand us beyond our contours. And that's growth, right? That is so valuable that we can't have if we didn't have that extraordinary experience. Now, that extraordinary experience wouldn't be extraordinary if we didn't have a benchmark to compare it to, the ordinary experience, right? So everything is relative. And the ordinary experiences, right? It's having coffee every morning. It's the walks with your dog in the morning, these types of things. Those are beautiful and valuable too. And in fact, our life is comprised of mostly ordinary experiences, which then lends itself, logically speaking, to mean that ordinary experiences are incredibly valuable because they compromise most of our life, and our life is insanely valuable and precious, right? So I think that there's value in both the ordinary and the extraordinary. Although I think people from how they're investing their money, let's say, are more so gravitating towards experiences over things as well. So again, a shift from the tangible to the intangible. And that's very much represented in the statistics around the experience economy, travel, and just the market trends in terms of what particularly the next generation is doing.
Yeah, and I think it totally weaves into what you were saying too about the investment in education and when you have experiential education woven into the fabric of the family dynamic and in personal life, it enriches your life on so many levels, and then allows you to really see, well, I can be inspired, and then there's ways that I can have an impact as well. And I think that that's another key piece in terms of that true wealth and sense of well-being is how to know that you contribute and you matter and you make a difference in the world. And I, I think that the point that you make about status would be interesting to explore from that realm as well, like how you can leverage who you're being in the world towards affecting outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. That status, I always smirk when anyone brings this one up because it's the asset, right, that, or the principle that gets the most inquiry and also gets the most yuck. Like it's become quite controversial actually. But when I and I understand it because this is the thing. As a society, we're revisiting and redefining wealth. I believe similarly, we're revisiting and redefining status as well, right? So we're reconceptualizing all of these assets codified in the five principles of invisible wealth, status being one of them. And when we think of status, and again, if we take a look back, because we want to look at the historical roots, the genesis of like where our concept of status came from, if we take a look back, we'd see that status was typically granted to nobility, right? But now I think there's a shift from status being granted to those from nobility to those who are pursuing noble pursuits. Right, there's this shift going on. So the way that we're attaining status is quite different than from times past. So it's more so about what can I give and provide to my community. And what's also fascinating with this is that community is now like the world in terms of the reach that people have by virtue of social media. So when we think about status, it's more so from my lens and on a more future forward interpretation of the word, a more generous interpretation of the word, is that status is actually valuing someone who's providing value to the broader community. And I think that's really beautiful. And that should inspire people to want to give and to provide. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And in fact, a lot of conversations, I'll say this too, a lot of conversations with clients, I mean, we do talk about status, and oftentimes a big reason why people don't want to leave their job is because they don't want to lose that status. They don't want to become irrelevant. And I think that this is kind of wrapped up in our sense of identity in a weird way. Like if someone's attained some status by virtue of the position that they hold at a certain company, right? I mean, and they've done all that they should do, could do, would do to attain that position, and they provide value to everybody, and they deserve it, and they're a wonderful person. Like that's great, but I think the reality is that we also need to be cognizant that that is important, to certain people, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, particularly when the status is achieved through noble pursuits. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're touching on something that I encounter quite frequently. So, in 20 years of working with well-established family businesses and helping them with their succession and their transitioning, it's probably the biggest pain point that can happen around this succession, because the person who has taken the business to where it is, whether they founded it or whether they took it from their parents and took it to the next level, there's tremendous status and identity invested in their role. And even though they may understand and see the importance of giving power and control to the next generation as they're coming up and allowing them to take risks and innovate in new ways, there is this sense of, well, this is who I am and my identity and everything that matters to me and my status in the community and my ability to influence and have a sense of meaning and purpose within this larger context. Who am I when I don't have that anymore? And one of the things I often say when I speak to, I don't know how you experience this, like with M&A firms or the CEPAs, the certified exit planning advisors, and like, well, when would we bring somebody like you in? It's like, oh, as soon as you possibly can, because that founder really needs to have a vision and a purpose and an identity well beyond the role that they're in, as you're also defining the roles of the people that are going to be stepping into having greater say and influence and power within the family structure. If they're going to keep it and if they're going to sell it, then what does it mean for the entire family to no longer have ownership or say in a business that they have their name on or that they've been known for? So I think that actually is an extremely important point, and I was really happy to see that you included it in it. And it's interesting that it's controversial, and I love that you're not afraid of that, And it's like, no, you say what's so and what people are investing in and what really has an impact on their lives, and then you get to see where there's the most interest, engagement, and also reactivity, right? It's like, oh, this is a triggering thing. How do we support and educate people on why this matters? And, if they have an upset about it, then it's like really looking at what does that mean to them? And that's the other side of the coin that I'd love to talk a little bit about in terms of the next gen and the disconnect, or I would say incoherence, with the wealth that they're inheriting, or that they participated on some level, but they're now going to have more say in, because of the disconnect within themselves around what does this mean in terms of my identity. So I'm wondering how
Mm-hmm.
you have seen that, and how invisible wealth has played a role in that to help them.
Sure. And by the way, I don't know if you can hear or not, but there's like bells going on. I'm like right beside a
Oh,
church here.
well,
um,
perfect timing, because this is so important. Like, let's
it is, it is.
shine a light and ring some bells around how to shift from a more incoherent way of approaching and being out of alignment with who you are in relationship to the wealth that you have financially, so that you can be much more aligned within yourself around what you're receiving as a next gen.
That's it's perfect actually because well when I knew we were going to talk obviously and you had asked what is coherence to you and I was like
Mhm.
that's yeah, what is coherence, what does this mean to me? And it's fascinating because and it's as though the this was timed because when I think about coherence I think about music, right? I think about harmonious music. I think about
Mhm.
what happens when notes are arranged in a really elegant way and that they play together. And when these notes are arranged in the right way, there's going to be the creation of coherence in my mind, something beautiful, something that
Mhm.
feels right. I think about coherence as like a feeling. It's not necessarily an intellectual thing. It's more emotional. It's more sensory. So yeah, it drums up feelings rather than thoughts, I guess, to use a pun. And then I also was thinking, because a lot of the work that I do with Invisible Wealth is very much focused on the individual, using the five principle framework and thinking through how does someone define their concept of wealth. In other words, what asset are they focused on attaining, maintaining, and optimizing the most? Okay, so with that, when you say coherence, my mind goes two places. It goes to individual coherence, and you alluded to this earlier, individual coherence and then relational coherence, right?
Mhm.
Or to put this in lingo that I love, like it goes to invisible coherence and to visible coherence, more so how it
Mhm.
gets manifested or created on the outside. And so individual coherence is when you're living in alignment with your values, like to go back to what we were talking about earlier, when you're living in alignment with your values and your thoughts, beliefs, and your decisions are in sync with each other. To keep with the musical theme here, it's when you have this inner integrity or this inner authority and self-sovereignty that is reflected in the way that you're orienting yourself in the world. It's you're defining your own concept of wealth on your own terms, and that's exactly what the invisible wealth ethos is an invitation to explore. And then when we think about relational coherence, and this goes to kind of like the family dynamics question, is that when you're living in alignment with your values, right, as an individual, but also as an individual, you're relating with others inherently. I mean, it's about syncing your thoughts, beliefs, and decisions with self, but also with for purposes of others.
Mhm.
And this is how you're able to build trust because it means that when I'm operating and living in alignment with my values, that means that I do what I say and I say what I mean, right? And when you're able to establish this consistency and clarity with others, that's how trust is created. And relationships move at the speed of trust, so the saying goes. So you need to have internal clarity first before you're able to build cohesion or coherence with others within your family structure. And I think everyone within a family has the opportunity to lean into what their values are and to get in alignment with their own coherence and to communicate that coherence to their family members. And it's figuring out how do we best play, right, to keep the theme going here, how do we best play like as a symphony to find harmony between all of our values? Like what's the best way to arrange this song so that it sounds beautiful for everyone? Maybe a son is a guitar player where his dad really wants him to be a piano player. Like he can say, Dad, I'm sorry, I'm not a piano player. That's just not my interest. It's not my skill set, but I'm happy to contribute with a guitar. Like, how can we make this song work? So I think it's figuring out and honoring where people are at and what their kind of concept of self is, and then figuring out a way to blend that in a really elegant way that's harmonious for everyone.
Yeah, I love that. It's my favorite analogy to use with coherence, for sure, because it's so understandable and people know it viscerally, right? And when I think about it, I think of the brain, the head being like the conductor, right? Because it's going to direct us in certain ways. And the heart is like the percussion, right? That's like that constant beat, that really solid rhythm that is in sync with the brain when they're working together. And the body is when you think about like the whole nervous system and how it's all connected and interrelated, that's like the string instruments. And it's like when they are all in harmony, there is that sense of flow, upliftment, ease, that intuition, like you followed to leave and write the book. It's like we just have this knowing about what's right, and it makes decisions easier to make. When we have that coherence internally, and it gets reflected externally so beautifully. And it does have this harmonious way of relating. And one
Mhm.
thing I want to highlight from what you said about the family and how to bring that, like you may be completely aligned internally when you're with your friends, when you're doing your work that you love, and you're creating and you're having the impact you want. And then you get back with the family system, it can be really challenging because there's this sense of this hasn't gone well in the past, or I'm not respected for who I am. Or, I mean, I love that you give that analogy, Dad, I can't play this, but I can play that. It's like, ideally that'd be wonderful. But in the course of like, and you're in a family business and your father is running it and he comes into your office and he says, stop doing this. I need you to do that. It's not as easy to just stop and say, well, hold on a minute. I got to say no to this, but I can do this. Like having the ability to do that within a family system is one of the greatest skills you can have. And it is all about trust, trusting yourself, and then trusting that you can have that conversation and recover and repair
Mhm.
if trust gets broken in some way. And I think one of the families I worked with really brought this home for me when we started to give them some great coaching on how to communicate effectively and bring forward who I am and have that be respected and honored. And in the course of that, some complaints came up and some things that people weren't so happy about came up. And the mom stopped and she said, wait, this is really uncomfortable. I want to go back to cordial hypocrisy. And it was like, yeah, if that's the standard within the family culture, go along to get along, don't bring up stuff, don't rock the boat. These are axioms or idioms that happen within family systems that keep us from really being able to do that. And so I think part of what we're highlighting is that there's another way to do this, and that there's a true and necessary ability to build that trust to be able to have those conversations and allow for individual alignment within the context of the family and have it be in alignment with the whole family. And I love that
Mhm.
idea of what makes it so each person's individual instrument gets to sing and vibrate at its frequency beautifully and harmoniously with what this family symphony is playing right now, and this what is our song that we need to be playing together. So that's
Yeah.
great. I love that we have that same analogy.
Well, and it's so funny because like I literally thought about this morning, and then I was thinking to myself, but it makes sense because I'm like, of course, my brain and Emily's brain think similarly. And I mean, again, too, I mean, coherence is one of these things that just brings up this feeling. The way you describe it with the head, the conductor, and like all of this, I'm like, oh, that's great. I love that. That's genius. But yeah, I think like, and you make a great point with the mom saying, can we just go back to like playing that song that we're all used to playing? It's really hard to come up with a new song. It's like awkward. It's weird. No one really knows their part. But like over time, you just keep on practicing, and then the song becomes miraculous, and it's probably a best hit, wonder, and you can like sell it. It's fantastic. But we just never really give ourselves the opportunity to get there, I think. And so it's just being okay to play in the gray. Something that I like to say, like being okay to play in the gray and to understand that it might be messy and that's okay. And this note probably should be moved this way, and it's reorientation and rejiggering. And that's life. It's
Yeah,
wonderful.
definitely. And another image I love to give people is when we have something that we're really familiar with and we're really comfortable with, that's like our comfort zone. And it can get quite small and rigid over time because there's, like the world becomes more challenging with all these different things. So it's like, I want to stay in my comfort zone. And when you go out of your comfort zone, you're in the learning zone, like you were just describing, like, oh, there's things to learn here and we get to learn together. But it feels like you're in the terror zone, right?
Mm.
And we forget that the learning zone is an okay place to have discomfort in, but it doesn't have to be scary or dangerous. It's more, oh, this is uncomfortable. And that's part of the trajectory that we have in terms of the learning curve and how to shift our whole orientation to what things mean. And it's really important when we're talking about wealth, right? Like I love that we've been talking about wealth this whole time. We haven't talked about money at all, right? So it's like that's so important to me because I think that when you bring up the word wealth, immediately in this day and age, people think about money. And, you know, how do you make the most of it? How do you deal with like the markets and if you have the other aspects of wealth that we've been talking about, really harmonious, in place, and thriving, it makes it so much easier to make the decisions you need to make about your money, to grow it, to have it go towards the values based approach to how you want to invest it, spend it, save it, use it, and give it, and have
Mhm.
that be something that's also very aligned with all of what we've been talking about. So,
Yeah. Oh, that's
yeah.
beautiful.
And what would you
Beautiful.
say about the financial piece in terms of the invisible side of wealth? Because I'd love to have your take on that.
My mind goes like a little ping pong machine, like 14 million ways,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of different kind of interpretations, I guess. Well, I mentioned earlier that of the five principles of invisible wealth, all are inherently or increasingly intangible. And just, I think it's kind of fascinating if, for those who are nerdy like myself, like the fact that money used to be shells, that it traversed into gold coins, then it traversed into dollar bills, and now it's electronic money and getting into digital money, right? So we can't even touch money, but it's like valuable nonetheless. So if that's not representation of the fact that things that you can't touch have money, I don't know what is. So there's that from an invisibility standpoint, like quite literally, quite practically, money is invisible, more so going forward. In terms of an investment standpoint, I mean, there's so much data and conviction, rightly so, in the power of staying invested. Right. So I say, in other words, keeping your money invisible, keeping it in the bank account, keeping it invested and not spending money on ridiculous things that you don't need. I mean, that's one interpretation as well. It could be invisible in the sense that you're using it to deploy or to invest in intangible assets such as experiences, right? So you're shifting your money into experiences and not necessarily things again, or you're using it to optimize the intangible assets of your life, relationships, experiences, your status, charitable kind of inclinations, philanthropy. Um, and you know, also this kind of gets into nuances around culture, in terms of how people use their money. I mean, there's some cultures where people are more inclined to be a little bit more visible about their money, whereas other cultures are a bit more reserved about the visibility around how they use their money. So, you know,
Mhm.
it's a dynamic question. But I think from a practical perspective, it's fun to think about the fact that money is intangible and yet we value it anyways. And that we're also using that money to invest in things that are also intangible, like experiences, and relationships, for example. And then also just keeping your money invested and or deploying it into ways that are going to productively influence those within society.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking about, I was with a client. We did a personal retreat at Rancho La Puerta, which is a wonderful ecologically conscious retreat center in Mexico. And she was so happy to be there and be anonymous. And
Mm,
they had communal tables that we ate our meals at, and we met some people at one of the tables. And one of the people discovered that my client was from New York, and she was from New York, and she started peppering her with questions. Where do you live? And she was kind of hesitant. She said, "Well, on the West Side." And then she said, "Oh, where? Which part?" You know, and she just kept drilling down, and I could just feel the discomfort in my client because it was like, it's the moment that she knows my address, she is going to immediately know and think she knows all kinds of things about me based on my zip code where I live. And that freedom in that moment of invisibility around her wealth and
yeah,
not being necessarily known by her family name, where she lived, who she worked with, you know, whatever it was, that just being was
yeah,
so freeing for her. And it's one of the things that we offer at the ranch that I am doing the retreats at, is that sense of just being present with who you are, where there aren't those questions being peppered at you, and where you get to just experience who am I, and what matters most to me, when all of those things aren't here to define me in this
mhm.
moment. And the horses are great for that because they don't care. They just want to know who you are in that moment. And they really do show you where you're not coherent, because if you are saying, "Oh no, I love horses," and the horse is like not wanting to go anywhere near you, there's some sort of disconnect between what you're putting forth in your field versus what you're saying. And that's just like one example. And I think that that invisible nature of who we are and how we are in the world is expressed all the time, and having that awareness about that is so important. And our money, how we choose to spend it, how we choose to use it, and how we share about it with people has an impact about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also was thinking about this movement towards investing in education as another way of saying, there's an intangible asset that we can really invest in individually and in the family system, because again, the money's gone, but you know how to learn. That you have the capacity to learn, that you can learn anything new, that you can build your skills. Then it's the kind of wealth that can never be taken away and never lost. And
Right.
I think about people and that are incarcerated. And the ones that do really well when they are released are the ones that use that time to get educated, to utilize the different services that are there to really expand their minds, expand their knowledge, and shift their orientation towards life to have a different
Mm.
approach. So those are some thoughts that have come to me as I'm listening to you talk about your orientation towards invisible wealth. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. There's so much value in learning and education, and I'm a firm believer too that that learning and that knowledge compounds, just like any other asset, right? And so it's wonderful to keep investing in self and to keep investing in this growth, because even
Mhm.
though again we can't quantify it, perhaps you can't put a price tag on it per se, at least not immediately. That asset is going to compound. Like the more you know, the more things kind of crystallize in abstraction, and your ability to comprehend different things just grows and grows and grows, which is really fun.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so interesting too about like how money is becoming more and more abstract and invisible, like you were saying. And children are very concrete in their thinking. And physically having money to play with, to put in a share, save, spend jars and see it grow and physically have that tangibility of it, I still so strongly encourage people to do that as much as you possibly can when they're little, so they have a concrete understanding and value of it. And then empowering them with it. Like, oh, if they want to, if they're in the store and they want to buy something, it's like not only how much money is in your spend jar, but also when you want to buy this, let's take a look at the size of the package and then how much is it actually per unit, and educating them, like using it as education, but in a really concrete, tangible way, because that abstraction can be really hard to understand the value of money when you haven't had that experience of it. So,
I agree. Yeah, it's the tangible experience of putting the coins, as you said, into the jars. Because also, it's just like learning anything. Like if you learn math, if you never put pen to paper and write 1 + 1 = 2, then like how do you have any concept for this algebraic expression that you're learning in high school? Like you need to understand the fundamentals on a really basic level and to like visualize how this all operates, right? Because without that, you have no foundation for the abstraction. Like is exactly what you're saying. For whatever reason, learning math came to mind. And it's like you have to understand how 1 + 1 = 2 works before you can get onto the other stuff, right? So everything in life is understanding the basics, the foundation. And the stronger the foundation, the better the build.
yeah, for sure. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you see is next for you and what you see is next in terms of this movement towards a new relationship to wealth.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And again, it's one that I've been steeped in immensely for the past 3 years, consciously at least. But I think, when I stepped away from the wealth management advisor seat, in retrospect, I stepped away from, let's say, quantitative wealth management into qualitative wealth management.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're both necessary for the wealth management conversation. I believe you have to have the quantitative conversation paired with the qualitative, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
two need to merge together. They're two sides of the same coin. And what I see is that historically, of course, there's been a lot of wealth management entities, family offices, registered investment advisors, private banks, things of the like, where the focus has been solely on money. And I get that. Like that's where we've been, right? But I think where we're going is implementing more qualitative wealth management. And what's been really fascinating is to see that there's the appetite and action to integrate qualitative wealth management. And I think a lot of that is working with consultants like, you, for example, and myself, and figuring out, okay, how can we use certain skill sets to kind of complement the existing structure, and as a consequence to mobilize it forward so that it's more holistic, just the same as we're thinking about wealth in a more holistic way. Because if you redefine wealth, you by extension have to redefine wealth management. Because if I, as an individual wealth holder, am reconceptualizing what wealth is, and my wealth management institution doesn't understand that, then there's a disconnect. There's no coherence, right? Bad. So I think it's figuring out, how do we complement each other with the people that are focused on the qualitative with an understanding for the quantitative, right? And the reverse is true. So there's this elegant dance that's going on, and I think that's pushing the industry forward. And so while I consider myself very much rooted in the wealth management space still, it's more so from the qualitative perspective than the quantitative.
Yeah, that's so well said. And I think, I think both of us are in this role of like a fractional, like I'm chief learning officer. There's also chief behavioral officers and chief experience officers. There's so many different ways of looking at how these particular lenses of looking at wealth and the more qualitative side of it can be integrated within a wealth management RIA family office structure. And it's so wonderful to be able to do it in an integrated way where there's consistency. And I'll often design action learning plans related to different ages and stages of development and bring in the family office advisors or their RIA advisors, financial advisors, to implement with me those action learning plans so that they develop an even more grounded, stronger relationship with the younger members of the family, and that it's really based on their interests and what it is that they want to learn more about. And then it fulfills like the family's desire for these inheritors to be prepared for the wealth and what they're going to have to be taking on in their lives, and understanding their responsibilities related to the roles that they're in. And I see like the education that you're doing within the advisory space, and I just think it's fantastic, and speaking at conferences and really educating the advisors on what's possible. And you're really open that conversation up in a big way.
And you say perfect meet. It's a win-win for everybody. It's literally a win-win for everybody.
Yeah.
So there's no reason why we shouldn't do it. It's only going to optimize the experience and progress the conversation forward.
Yeah. And where can people find you, Jen, if they want to know more about your speaking or your book or what you're up to?
Yeah, everywhere. all the domains.
I know.
Pick whichever you choose. I mean, gosh, LinkedIn, Substack. I have my own website, which you can find my email on. What else? Instagram, YouTube, a little bit. So yeah, just a little Google search and select whichever mode is of preference.
Yeah. Well, I love it. And I'm definitely a raving fan. And I love whenever you write your Substack and getting your newsletter about what's the latest and how you keep focusing on the 5 different domains of invisible wealth so people can really dive into those more and more deeply. So thank you for your time and for your passion for this. It's wonderful.
Oh my gosh, Emily, such an absolute pleasure and joy. And thank you so much for having me on. And again, since day one, our conversation, so much coherence, and even more now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Wealth Coherence. If it resonated, I'd love for you to share it or leave a review. This will help others find their way to this space. And if you're ready to keep exploring what it means to live, lead, and give from a place of coherence, head to emilybouchard.com to stay connected. Until next time, be well internally and allow your external life to be the fullest expression of who you truly are.